Welcome to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. Okay, who am I? I'm Encarni Martin, a student of Granada in English literature, and today we're going to be talking with Sofia Sabiote, who has taken and greatly enjoyed the course of North American literature too this past term and has a lot to tell us about her essay. Thank you so much for joining us, Sofia. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about my essay and I hope you find it interesting.
If I'm not mistaken, and I might as well be, your research was focused on the influence of Washington Irving's short story, The Lay on Sleepy Hollow, which is from 1819, on Tennessee Williams' play A Streetcar Named Desire, which I think was first performed in Boston in November 1947. Our listeners might also recognize the adaptation with Vivian Leigh and Marlon Brando, she's really famous, from 1951. I wanted to ask, why did you choose both texts?
Why did I choose them? For the essay, we needed to explore the influence of an American author prior to the 20th century, prior to realism, um, in one of the authors that we were studying in class, and the course covered realism, modernism, postmodernism, and post-postmodernism. And I ended up selecting Tennessee Williams, obviously because I felt attracted to the play, and because of how he incorporated two literary traditions, realism and romanticism, that collide in the work, and it just reminded me of Washington Irving's short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in which also two literary traditions were incorporated and crashed, and one of them was also romanticism. It was the enlightened style of the times and romanticism, which came from Europe. I did some research trying to find if any scholar had already compared them, and I didn't find any article related to it. And I know that it seems far fetched at first, but I thought that because of Washington Irving's status as the first significant author of American fiction, his influence had to permeate into the rest of authors that came after him. And even though they were writing 100 years apart, both were creating these works in times of social and historical transformation. In the case of Irving, it was the early years of the American Republic, and in the case of Williams, it was post World War II America.
That is extremely interesting, and I was told that the introduction of AI tools was mandatory for the development of your essay, which is unheard of. And I was wondering, how did you incorporate that and what your conclusions are about their use?
Yes, we needed to incorporate AI, which is very unfortunate, honestly. And this time I just asked ChatGPT about the context, the historical, aesthetic, and cultural context of both texts, and I corrected everything that was wrong or not accurate about it. To be honest, I just did not trust it. ChatGPT in terms of the analysis, I much rather do it myself, and it was gonna be a lot less time consuming. And even though correcting the context was very time consuming, because if you ask ChatGPT for sources, the sources that the tool is gonna give you, they're not gonna be correct. They're gonna be wrong. Some of them don't even exist, or it takes you to articles that have nothing to do with the topic. When the tool provided me with information that was not false or completely false, it was usually very general and not specific. So I guess that my conclusions are that it's not really worth it. The time that can't save you, you're gonna waste it just correcting it. And ChatGPT writing style is so blunt that honestly bores you to death.
I completely understand what you mean because I wouldn't trust GPT with when analyzing literary texts either. Surprising how many people resort every day to it when it's such a deeply flawed tool. Going back to your research, tell us a little bit about the authors, Irving and Williams, and the context in which they created their works.
Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about the authors. Washington Irving was born in New York. He was the last children of a Scottish born father and an English born mother. He wrote shortly after the Revolutionary War and during the early years of the Republic, when a big thing was the forging of a national identity distinct from Europe. He is the first American writer of the 19th century to achieve an international literary reputation, and he was a comic writer. His satirical writings were very funny, but he also addressed complex topics like historical transformation. He wrote travel sketches, satirical essays, and he is considered one of the inventors of the modern short story. I'll be addressing this later, but because he was writing in the transitory period between the 18th century and Romanticism, he was greatly inspired by both, even though his writing style was very 18th century. Well, Tennessee Williams was a postmodernist author who was born as Thomas Lanier Williams in Mississippi, and he wrote more than 20 full-length dramas as well as screenplays and shorter works. He changed his name to Tennessee after moving to New Orleans, which will provide the setting for A Streetcar Named Desire. A Streetcar Named Desire, the Pulitzer Prize-winning play, which, as you said, premiered in 1947 in Boston, was written in the aftermath of World War II, and in America, characterized for the growing tension between traditional values and the forces of modernity. Williams' writing is marked by vivid, poetic language and a heightened emotional tone. There's a confessional quality in his works, even if his plays are not directly autobiographical. And there's also the presence of taboo topics and an emphasis on desire and loneliness.
So, a big part of your analysis involves literary traditions that are put into conflict in his works. Could you explain briefly each of them?
Yes, Irving was in the middle of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and the Enlightenment and the 18th century movement was concerned with reason and order. And in terms of language, there was a desire for simplicity, clarity, restraint, regularity. So in this century, satire thrives because of the concern with social order, and also Enlightenment really greatly valued imitation. However, Romanticism, which has its origins in the ending of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, in fact, Irving is considered the author responsible for introducing continental Romanticism and the Gothic into American writing. Romanticism was characterized by its elevated language, heightened emotion, originality, nature, the supernatural, escapism through runes, and the romantic subject or the outcast, even though it's not really present in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. However, it is present in A Streetcar Named Desire in the character of Blanche, who is an outcast in a society she doesn't really belong to. In A Streetcar Named Desire, there's romanticism and there's realism. Realism is a literary movement that emerged in the mid 19th century and came to America from Europe. And realistic literary fiction was rooted in the observation and documentation of the details of everyday life, and the text claims that it is a transparent imitation of fact. So, against the exaggerated themes of romanticism, realism aims to portray everyday life and society. So, it emphasizes ordinary characters, realistic settings, and plausible events.
That's really interesting. And in which particular aspects can the reader identify these literary aesthetics?
Well, in the case of Washington Irving, he was writing in the transitory period between the 18th century and Romanticism, so both literary traditions influence his work. The presence of the Enlightened tradition is mainly recognized in his writing style, and he was well familiarized with the use of satirical devices because he had been writing satirical essays about New York society from a really young age, which he published under a pseudonym. However, his romantic and gothic elements, the ones that are included in the work, are presented as a parody. He was introduced to German folk tales by Sir Walter Scott when he moved to England, where he remained a very long time. And the Romantic tradition has its origin in German literature, which is interesting. There's a description of the bank of the Hudson River. The description of the landscape is a very romantic thing, a relevant feature, and this description of the Hudson River bank is parodied by the exaggeration and embellishment of sensual details like the water running or the birds chirping. And he also employs the dream motif as a literary device to construct the atmosphere and introduce the notion of superstition, which is related to the romantic commonplace of ruins of medieval castles and the supernatural, which the romantic employed as a way of escapism. However, Irving subverts this commonplace by making the reader well aware that this is impossible. It's impossible to adapt this as an American writer because of the novelty of the country. In A Streetcar Named Desire, the romantic tradition is also present. The audience encounters two opposing literary traditions, which are introduced by the narratives created by the main characters, Stanley Kowalski and Blanche Dubois. The play presents two aesthetic models that also signify different representations of America, past and present, the realistic and the non-realistic, namely romantic models. Moreover, in both works, in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and in A Streetcar, we find cliches. And in A Streetcar, we find the cliche of the romantic Southern belle, which is embodied by Blanche, and the cliche of the Pollock, which is embodied by Stanley. And it is the fact that these characters feed these cliches so seemingly that reveals their fiction and points to the postmodernist nature of the work. Blanche represents the romantic tradition, and she is an outcast, which is a very romantic idea in a society she doesn't belong to anymore. She wants to believe in her fiction and rejects realism. She wants magic. And Stanley is a man of the times and embodies the brutality of post-World War II America, as well as the literary convention of realism. Stella, who is Blanche's sister and Stanley's wife, is placed in the middle of both characters, and the audience, by identifying with her, are also asked to choose between Blanche's fiction and the promise of security and maternity that Stanley provides. Stanley finds his world threatened by Blanche's attempt to by Blanche's arrival and her attempt to impose her romantic southern vision. However, both characters try to enforce their construction, and when both literary traditions collide, both narratives are revealed to be false and just fictional. Similarly, in Legend of Sleepy Hollow, we find two characters of opposite characteristics, Ichabod Crane and Brum Bones, that embody cliches and try to get the attention of a young lady, Katrina Van Tassel.
So, you have mentioned the idea of literary traditions colliding. What is exactly the effect of this collision in both texts?
Well, in terms of the effect produced, through the use of satirical devices, Irving elaborates a parody of these romantic and gothic features, so the effect is going to be humorous, and because the reader is aware of the romantic literary tradition and has expectations and recognizes elements like the dreamy atmosphere and the supernatural and the escapism by means of runes. So the exaggeration of and alteration of these elements causes humor, and Irving uses this to mock the romantic style that some authors copy in order to establish an American tradition, which was a big thing at the time, the search of a literary identity, because he resorted to the celebration of regionalism and folklore instead. In A Streetcar Named Desire, Blanche and Stanley can only exist in the particular aesthetic environments, and the effect of the collision between literary traditions is non humorous, the conventional one. I think it leaves a sense of uneasiness. Um, the author does not really provide like a definitive answer. So there's the impossibility of reforming the old world, but also the inability of really giving birth to a new one.
Well, I have to say that at first this seemed very unlikely, and I had a lot of questions, but I think you have explored very convincingly in Irving's influence. So thank you for sharing your research with us. It's been a great time. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.